Hello everyone, welcome to the next chapter in the animal behavior course. Today is chapter 5.1 where we're going to be discussing animal intelligence. So today we're asking a deceptively simple question. What is intelligence in animals? At first glance that might sound straightforward. Intelligence is about being smart, right? But as soon as we try to pin down what smart actually means across species, things can get a little bit tricky. Different animals face very different challenges. A crow might need to solve tool use problems while a migratory bird has to remember locations across thousands of miles. And an octopus has to camouflage instantly in complex environments. So the question is, which one is the most intelligent? Or are they all intelligent in different ways? That's where definitions become messy, and the way that we measure intelligence often reflects human skills and values, but they don't necessarily apply to other species. Humans have certain skills that apply to our lives, while as animals have different skills that apply to their lives. There's actually a famous quote, most often attributed to Albert Einstein, but there's debate about whether he said this or not. But basically it says that if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it's stupid. This really encapsulates the point of this lecture. It's hard to judge an animal by its intelligence, or to even provide a definition to the term, because animals are so different in so many ways. Therefore, the point of this lecture is to not rank humans and animals on a scale from smart to stupid, but rather to investigate the following two questions. Number one, what capabilities do animals have? And the second question is, what explains why some animals have the capabilities and others do not? Basically, what caused some species to develop quote unquote smart abilities and others to use simpler, more basic mechanisms? So let's dive in. Animals perform a lot of really remarkable behaviors, but it's sometimes really hard to tell if these remarkable feats are the result of something complex, like a mental representation, or rather the result of something much simpler, like the learning that we talked about in the last chapter of this course. For example, a rat running a maze may have formed a mental map of the maze and ran it to perfection, or it may have just learned a simple set of associative rules. When I turn left, right, left, left, I get a reward. Similarly, bees could be using spatial learning to create a mental map, or it could just be a color-odor association that they've built through receiving positive reinforcement of nectar rewards. But this highlights something really important. Animals do amazing things, regardless of whether the behavior comes from so-called complex cognition or from simpler associative processes. They navigate their environments and their social lives with incredible expertise. They see, smell, taste, and hear things in ways that we simply cannot. From bees perceiving ultraviolet patterns of flowers, to dogs tracking scents, to birds using magnetic fields to migrate. Even if they aren't smart in the human sense, they're brilliant in their own unique ways, perfectly tuned to their ecological niches. And honestly, the word intelligence isn't a great one, not even for humans. Humans aren't uniformly intelligent across all tasks either. We have domains of strength and weaknesses, and our so-called intelligence is really just a patchwork of specialized abilities. In the same way, animals may excel in domains that matter for survival, even if those domains look very different from what we call intelligence in ourselves. So instead of ranking species on a single scale of smartness, it's more accurate to think about the diverse forms of cognition or expertise that have evolved in response to different challenges. However, despite this caveat, you will see people, and scientists included, refer to animals as being cognitively complex or even smart. So what is it that they mean when they say this? Well, when we refer to cognition, or more complex processes, we're often referring to abilities that go beyond associative learning. In the last chapter, we discussed these forms of learning. For example, habituation, sensitization, classical conditioning, and operant conditioning. These are all widespread in animals. We saw how the sea slug can habituate and sensitize to stimuli. All other animals, including humans, rely on these simple forms of learning. But why? Well, because they're effective and they're cost efficient. Why would you use more resources if simpler mechanisms get the job done just as, if not more, effectively? Now, with that being said, we know that humans don't only use associative processes, right? Here's one example. If I told you that Chris was taller than Austin, and that Austin was taller than Enzo, then you can use deductive reasoning to infer that Chris must also be taller than Enzo. But I never told you that, right? You were never reinforced for knowing that answer. You don't even know who Chris, Austin, and Enzo are. but you figured it out. That's because you have a cognitive ability known as transitive inference, which is the ability to infer the relationship between two items that you've never encountered together solely based on their relationship to a third item. Now, you don't need to remember this one example specifically, but I highlight it because there are instances where associative processes do not get the job done. And the results from animal studies suggest that the way animals behave would make more sense if animals had access to these specific, potentially complex cognitive abilities. So now, if humans go beyond simple associations and use abilities like transitive inference or mental maps, it begs the question, why would animals need to develop similar cognitive tools? What kinds of situations in the wild would make such abilities not just useful, but necessary for survival? Think about it. If you were asked on an exam, why might an animal need intelligence or cognition, what would be your answer? What areas of their lives might be the most important for being able to think complex thoughts? Animals aren't just moving through their environment randomly. They face challenges like finding food, avoiding predators, navigating social hierarchies, and solving problems to reproduce successfully. These pressures create scenarios where relying purely on trial and error learning or simple associations might just not cut it. The two domains we're going to focus on here are foraging challenges, which is how an animal feeds to survive, and social challenges, which is how an animal navigates its social life with other animals. Under the ecological intelligence hypothesis, the idea is that animals develop intelligence to tackle challenges in their environment. Imagine you're a squirrel trying to remember where you buried your food months ago, or a monkey navigating a dense forest to locate fruit. These aren't simple tasks, so they need memory, planning, and sometimes problem-solving skills. Research shows that species facing these ecological challenges often have the ability to use complex cognitive abilities. For example, squirrels are famous for remembering the locations of their hidden caches of nuts, kind of like Scrat from Ice Age if you ever saw that movie. And they obsessively track down these acorns, just like Scrat in the movie, but in real life, it actually helps them to survive. Now, one paper that lays this hypothesis out is a paper from 2017 by Alex Rosati. In this paper, she discusses some of the evidence for why foraging challenges may be the driving pressure for cognition. However, she makes a point to only discuss cognition that would be relevant to foraging, things like spatial memory, value-based decision-making, and inhibitory control. The evidence she lays out first is the comparison between chimpanzees and bonobos. So let's take a closer look at these two species. Chimpanzees and bonobos are our two closest relatives. A lot of people actually will mix them up. They look very, very similar, but they behave in very, very different ways. They both live in broadly similar habitats and have comparable social structures, but their foraging problems are quite different. Chimpanzees rely heavily on patchy seasonal fruit, and they also engage in costly extractive foraging and even hunting. These challenges mean that they often have to travel long distances, wait for resources to ripen, or invest energy into uncertain resources. Now, bonobos, in contrast, feed more consistently on terrestrial herbs and have more stable food availability. Now, when we study their behavior, we find that these two species, despite being very closely related to one another and to us, differ in several value-based decisions. Scientists have hypothesized that these differences could be due to different foraging pressures that each species lives under. For example, chimpanzees tend to be more patient in intertemporal choice tasks, basically mean that they're willing to wait for longer for a larger reward. And they're also more risk-seeking, which means that they're willing to tolerate uncertain outcomes for the chance at a high-value payoff or a jackpot. In contrast, bonobos show less patience, and they don't really prefer risky outcomes, instead preferring safe and consistent options, which is much more similar to the foraging decisions that they make in their natural environments. So the key takeaway here is that ecological differences, specifically with the difficulty and unpredictability of foraging, can map directly onto differences in decision-making strategies. Chimpanzees evolved to handle risk and delay, while bonobos didn't face the same pressures, so this is reflected in their cognition. While the ecological intelligence hypothesis highlights how environmental challenges can drive cognition, another possibility is that animals possess these complex abilities to navigate their social lives. Think about it. For an animal that lives in large social groups, it is adaptive and very beneficial for survival and reproductive success to be able to navigate social life efficiently and correctly. If you're a monkey living in a large group, you need to be able to maintain alliances, understand where you are within the hierarchy, and predict others' behavior. These pressures may be even more important than the pressures of finding food. Therefore, the social intelligence hypothesis suggests that animal intelligence evolves to navigate social life. Animals that can understand and predict the behavior of their peers gain a big advantage over others. Evidence from primates and cetaceans support this idea. Chimpanzees, baboons, capuchins form alliances, they reconcile after conflicts, and even manipulate others in ways that suggest they understand relationships and possibly intentions. Dolphins or other cetaceans similarly live in large, fluid social groups, cooperate on hunting, maintain strong bonds, and demonstrate behaviors that indicate sophisticated social cognition. In short, the social intelligence hypothesis predicts that animals facing complex social challenges should have access to processes that help them navigate these social challenges, because navigating friendships and rivalries and alliances isn't just a bonus, it's critical for their reproductive success and survival. A great paper from the assigned readings of this course was written by Benjamin Ashton and colleagues. In this paper, it outlines the social intelligence hypothesis and how evidence suggests that group living may have driven the evolution of more complex cognition. However, it takes a unique approach. Instead of looking between species, like most researchers do when studying these hypotheses, it suggests that we should also look within a species. If group living drives cognition, then animals living in larger groups should show increased abilities than animals in the same species living in smaller groups. The Australian magpie provides evidence for this exact prediction. When researchers studied wild magpies in groups ranging from 3 to 12 individuals, they gave the birds a battery of cognitive tests, including spatial memory, reversal learning, associative learning, and inhibitory control tests. The results were striking. Magpies in larger groups consistently performed better across these tasks, and these effects became stronger as juveniles matured. What's even more important is that there was a link to fitness. Females with higher cognitive scores had greater reproductive success. Now, this study shows that living in larger, more complex groups can directly drive the development of cognitive abilities. And it also highlights the value of studying variation within a species, not just across species, when testing these evolutionary hypotheses. Now, let's compare the two main hypotheses. The ecological intelligence hypothesis says cognition develops to solve environmental and foraging problems. The focus is on challenges like finding patchy resources, remembering their location, using tools to extract food, or making complex decisions about risk and delay while foraging. In other words, intelligence evolves because the physical environment is unpredictable and requires advanced problem solving. The social intelligence hypothesis takes a different view. It argues that living in large or complex social groups creates the strongest pressure for intelligence. Here the challenges are about tracking relationships, managing alliances, avoiding deception, and navigating dominance hierarchies. In this case, intelligence is mainly about understanding and predicting the behavior of other individuals. So what do they predict? Well, the ecological intelligence hypothesis predicts that species with more demanding diets, larger home ranges, or extractive foraging strategies will have better spatial memory, greater patience, and stronger executive control. The social intelligence hypothesis predicts that species in larger or more complex social groups will show superior social learning, communication, and perspective-taking abilities. In short, the ecological intelligence hypothesis says that intelligence is about dealing with food and the environment, while the social intelligence hypothesis is about dealing with social partners or social relationships. So, which one do we think is more correct? Well, unlike these lemurs on the slide, the answer is not black and white. Just like nature versus nurture, there's probably a combination of both. In some species, ecology prevails as the driving pressure, and in other species, sociology is the driving force. But this does not mean that they both don't play a role or contribute to all species in some way. This is what led Rosati to propose the mosaic view in the 2017 paper that was assigned for this course. This paper suggests that the intelligence doesn't just come from one force, ecological or social, but rather from a combination with different pressures shaping different domains of cognition. This is a diagram from that paper that really effectively communicates the idea of how both ecology and sociality may contribute to cognitive abilities by looking at very closely related species of lemurs. So let's see what they found. For example, frugivorous species like ruffed lemurs rely on patchy seasonal fruit, and they consistently outperform folivorous species which rely on plants or leaves like shafakas on tasks involving spatial memory and inhibitory control. That is evidence for ecological pressures shaping cognition. Frugivorous species face more complex challenges when finding food than the folivorous species, and they show more advanced abilities in things like spatial memory and inhibitory control. At the same time, however, lemurs with more complex social structures, such as ring-tailed lemurs that live in large groups with dominance hierarchies, excel in social cognition tasks. For instance, they're better at using gaze cues and making transitive inferences about social relationships. And so this really highlights the mosaic view as how both ecology and sociality can contribute to the domain-specific processes involved in both of these hypotheses. So the takeaway from the lemur data is that cognitive abilities evolve in a domain-specific or mosaic pattern. Ecological challenges shape foraging cognition, while social challenges shape social cognition. This integrated view helps better explain why evidence from both the ecological and social intelligence hypothesis have been mixed. Both are right, but for different parts of the mind. And so that concludes this lesson. Just remember, for this lesson, you need to remember what exactly is intelligence and why using that term may not be the best for describing animals or even humans. Also know what the ecological intelligence hypothesis is, the social intelligence hypothesis is, what they both would predict in a species, and also what the mosaic view is.